And with that, we're going to get started. Hi, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you today by Zoom and talking about environmental influences and flowering in plants. So when we're talking about that, we want to start with the idea of the stages of reproductive development in plants. And really that's going to start off with maturation, which is just the plant getting old and established enough in order to be ready to flower. The plant needs, in some cases, different amounts of time just to develop and mature in order to be ready to produce flowers and go into reproductive development. After that, we need some event that's going to sort of induce the plant, get it ready to start that process, and that will sort of start the process of that flower forming. And then you actually have the biological process of that flower developing. It starts, the start of the growth of the flower, and it's going through the development of the flower entirely. When we talk about environmental influences on flowering, the two big ones that we want to discuss are going to be photoperiodism, which is really just talking about that duration of light and darkness. So the amount of time that the sun is out and the amount of time that the night is can have a lot of influences on plant growth. And the other really, really important environmental factor is temperature, and that's the cycle of temperature throughout the course of the year. And we refer to that as thermoperiodism. So I want to start off talking about photoperiodism. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this topic is that our understanding of photoperiodism is not as old as I would have expected it to be. The discovery of photoperiodism and really the description of how plants are influenced by that period of light and darkness really goes back to about 1920. And some research that was done in Maryland through the USDA. They had a type of tobacco plant called Maryland Mammoth. And unlike the regular tobacco plants, it would not flower during the summer, despite growing up to a significant height, but then it would flower in the winter. And they went through all sorts of different tests to kind of see what was controlling that impact, that impact of timing on the flowering of the plant. And they finally discovered by growing it in growth chambers that were sealed, where they could control the amount of light and the duration of light that the plant was getting, that the important influence there was the length of time that the plant was exposed to light, the length of time the plant was in the dark. Another really good example of this from agriculture is soybean plants. And I worked for a number of years with soybean plants, and they are divided up into different maturity groups. And when they're planted out in the field, that type of soybean, regardless of when you plant it, is going to wind up flowering at the same time. So they doesn't matter what day you plant it. When that plant receives that signal that from the amount of daylight and nighttime there is, that plant's going to start flowering. We actually divide up our types of soybean into these maturity groups and assign them to kind of the areas where we would grow those. And it makes sense that photoperiod is a way for the plant to detect how the duration or the time of year, because that day length is going to vary with the season. So the process of photoperiodism is really interesting in plants, how plants perceive light and how that transmits and turns into the different biological processes that go on in plants is really interesting. So there is a pigment in leaves called phytochrome, and that is the pigment that receives that signal. And that is located in the leaves. The same leaves that are absorbing light for photosynthesis. And then that signal is somehow transmitted from the leaves to the bud in order to initiate flowering. In the original description of this, the person who did that suggested that there was a substance that he called phloragen that was transmitted from the leaves to the bud in order to promote flowering. And a lot of people, didn't believe that. Didn't seem like a good explanation. But as we've gone on, we have discovered some different genes that are involved and some proteins that are involved in this. So honestly, the process of how that message of light reception in the leaves is transmitted to the buds is really still not fully understood. Now, what we do know is that in response to different kinds of light, it influences this molecule in the plants called phytochrome. And there are two different versions of phytochrome. There's what we call phytochrome red and then phytochrome far red. So when the plant receives red light, which it does from the sun, that phytochrome is turned from phytochrome red into phytochrome far red. And then when the plant receives far red light, that same molecule is turned back from phytochrome far red back to phytochrome red. And that can be really confusing. When I first learned about this, I always got it backwards. Of course, you also have that phytochrome far red turning back into phytochrome red when you're in the dark. And the really important thing here is that we can consider phytochrome far red to be the active form of that molecule. So when we have long days, the plant is exposed to a lot of that red light, well, we're going to have an accumulation in the plant of that active form of this molecule. We have short days, we're going to allow a lot of that to convert back to phytochrome red. And so that's sort of what's going on in the leaf that is in response to light that produces this signal that the plant can interpret in order to respond to its environment. Because we understand how this is done, we can also use this as a way to manipulate plant flowering because we can manipulate the light that the plants are exposed to. So again, getting back to how the plants are perceiving light, if we have unfiltered sunlight, so the plant is out in direct light, that sunlight is going to contain a lot of red light. But that red light gets blocked out if the plant is underneath the leaf canopy of other plants, or even as the sun sets, we're going to wind up with more far red light or less red light that's going to allow that phytochrome to turn back into that inactive form that doesn't give that signal. So some things to think about. Far red light not really conducive to photosynthesis. It's not going to allow that plant to create energy, and that really allows that plant to know that it's being shaded out by other things. And so this whole process is involved in a lot of the responses of the plant. So as the plant can grow taller, it can influence the number and the size of leaves that the plant has. It's even involved in seed germination. So this comes up in when we're talking about weeds, that oftentimes when we till over soil, that leads to a germination of weeds. And what's happening is we have these small seeds in the ground, little seeds like things like lettuce that have very small seeds. They don't have a big energy reserve. So they want to make sure that they're going to be in a place where they're going to be able to collect sunlight to produce more energy. And so some small seeds have to have that response where they've received a lot of red light to let them know they're in a place where they're going to be able to germinate and have enough light for them to grow. Now, when we talk about photoperiod, we always say photoperiod, and that implies that what's really important is that it's the length of time that we're in the light that's important. For plant biology, and this might be more a kind of small detail, but it's actually the length of darkness that matters. And the term for that is scotoperiod. We don't hear that nearly as often. But we still use the term photoperiod really because that's the term as it was coined, and all of the original descriptions use that term. And so just sort of by the weight of time having passed and tradition, we always refer to photoperiod when we're talking about the responses of these plants. So when we talk about that plant response, we can break down plants into different categories. You'll often hear this as long day plants and short day plants. And really a long day plant is a plant that's going to start flowering when that day length is longer than some critical length. And that length is going to be dependent on the species of plant, as well as some other factors that might be going on. But these long day plants are generally going to start flowering as those days are getting longer. So as we get into the spring and the days are getting longer, as we get into early summer, as the days are continuing to get longer, that's when we're going to see the flowering from these plants. And so you can see here kind of an example of that. This is an example in irises, and you can see up at the top here, you have a line across there, and of course it says critical noctoperiod instead of scotoperiod, just a little bit of a difference in terminology. But you can see when the day length, when the white period in that little bar is pushes down beneath that critical point, you get flowering in that plant. But when that light area is above that critical period, you don't wind up with that flowering. Now, I mentioned, it's the period in dark that matters and not the period in light. What those other two lines are, as you can see, they tried to introduce a period of time during the day when the plant wasn't exposed to light, and that didn't have any influence on flowering. So we know that just shading the plant during the middle of the day isn't going to be effective. But interestingly, if we break up the darkness, if in the middle of the dark period of the day, or the dark period when we're growing that plant, we include a period of time in the middle when the plant receives light, that breaks up the length of that dark period, and we actually get flowering in these long day plants. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. The contrast to a long day plant is a short day plant, and they are going to flower when the period of time of the day is shorter than a particular critical length. Again, that is going to vary by the different species that we're dealing with. And it's important to understand that after the day length gets a little bit too short, you may not see flowering. So they still have to be kind of in a range there that's ideal for plant growth. And you often see these plants flowering in late summer or fall or early winter, when we have, again, those day lengths shortening down, and so they flower as our day length crosses that critical point. Here you can see a good example from poinsettia, and again, it's kind of the same thing here. When you have that day length and night length, or the day length below that critical point, you don't get flowering. When the nighttime is longer, you get flowering from that plant. However, you can see that breaking that up again is not going to result in flowering, though it is still possible to kind of manipulate the plant's perception of light in order to result in flowering, sort of out of season. Now, just to make things a little bit more involved, there are some plants that are not responsive to day length. Tomato is a good example of this, and dandelion is another. Their flowering is not really influenced at all by day length. They're going to flower regardless of what day length there is. And just to kind of add something into that as well, there are plants that we refer to as obligate day length, certain day length plants, and then facultative day length plants. And in obligate, you can think about oblige or obligate. The plant must have that critical period of daylight in order to flower. Whereas for a facultative plant, it helps. It's assisted by having that extra day length, but it's not absolutely necessary. Some good examples of plants kind of grouped up by what their response to light is. So long day plants, we have things like cabbages and carrots, but also petunias and poppies. Short day plants, cosmos and dahlias and morning glory, poinsettia and violets. And a lot of our day neutral plants are going to be things like tomatoes, but also corn, cucumbers, and beans all fit into that day neutral category, as well as rhododendron. Another thing that's really interesting about plant responses to light is where the plant is from actually matters. So you can think, here in the southern United States, and certainly more as we get closer to the equator, the difference that we have in terms of how long it stays light and how long it stays dark isn't as extreme as it would be as you move further away from the equator. I experienced this when I moved to the UK. I was really unprepared for how long the day would last or how long the night would last at different times of year. And so plants that originate really by species more than anything else from more extreme ends of the latitude, if they're from very far up north or from a very southern location in the southern hemisphere, they tend to have more extreme requirements. They tend to require a bigger difference in day length in order to get that response of starting flowering. Things from down here, things from the equator are not going to require quite as much of a difference in order to start flowering. So of course, the interesting part of this is that we can use day length and manipulate that in order to affect when the plant grows. So if you have a plant, you have a short day plant, but our day length is long, we can very simply, in the evening, we can put some fabric over the plants and just extend the length of time that the plant is not being exposed to light. And that kind of simulates having that short day. And then that way we can produce that short day plant even when we have long days. This is practically used in fall mum production. We want those plants to flower a little bit earlier. And so they just shade the plants in order to give the plant that signal. Kind of the opposite side of that is if we're growing plants that are long day plants when the day is naturally short, then we need to break up that darkness. And you can do that one of two ways. You can do that just by turning the lights on in the evening and just having those lights on through the period of time, that suggests from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., just naturally extending the day. The other thing you can do, and tends to be a little bit more common, is you can introduce a break in the middle of the night where you just expose the plants to light, and that kind of starts that process back again. And then you have that simulation of a long day that produces that flowering. Some other examples here, we have cosmos, which are a great flower. They are short day plants, but they're facultative short day plants. So they don't have to have a short day to flower, but it helps them along. They're going to flower a lot faster under short days than they would in a long day. And so if we grow them under continuous long days, we get flowers in about 65 days. But if we grow them under continuous short days, they can flower in less than half the time, which is pretty neat if you're selling plants and even if you're just putting them out in your home landscape. Another common plant that's a good example there is black-eyed Susan or Rudbeckia. It is an obligate long day plant. It has to have long days in order to flower. So if we grow them under long days, they flower in about 12 weeks. You grow them under short days, they are not going to flower at all. You have to introduce that additional light either at the end of the day or to break up the night in order to get flowering and then off season. Just a kind of another little note there, I mentioned that you had to have maturation in order for the plants to flower at all. So Rudbeckia is a good example of that, where after the seed is germinated, you have that seedling up, it's going to need a period of time, about 4 weeks, in order to be able to flower. Before that, it's just not going to be sensitive to the amount of light you provide. It's not going to flower no matter what while it's in that juvenile period. So the other side of the plant response to the environment is what we would call thermoperiodism, and that is the response of plants to cycles of temperature fluctuation. And you see a lot of the same things in thermoperiodism that you see in responses to light. Again, the variation that we're going to see here in South Mississippi or Mississippi is certainly not what we would see up in New York or somewhere like that, and really not what we would see at the equator. So again, where that plant comes from can have an influence in how they respond to changes in temperature. In terms of how thermoperiodism happens, how the plant senses that, it is sensed in the buds, the growing tip of the plant. Um, the actual mechanism is really complicated and not really fully understood. There are some things that go on with the internal parts of the plant cell that are involved and respond to temperature, but not really well understood at all. Where we generally think about thermoperiodism is for vernalization. Vernalization is really just, you know, the the term vernal is really just another language way to say spring. So we're springifying the plants. What we do is we expose those plants to low temperatures in order to induce flowering. And we talked about this a little bit, and we'll talk about this a little more as but we've talked about it when we talk about bulbs or talk about fruit trees. So in some cases, we can satisfy those cold requirements that the plant has and allow them to flower earlier. Again, those cold temperatures are perceived by the buds and by the growing tips of the plant or the meristems. And depending on what species you have, what kind of plant it is, it may require several days or several weeks at temperatures above 32 degrees Fahrenheit or right above freezing, but below about 45 degrees. Interesting, a lot of our vegetable plants will actually flower earlier if we expose them to a brief period of cold temperature. So one of the ways that we kind of use vernalization is, we have bulbs in our landscape, and we need to put them in the cold temperatures in order to promote them flowering. So we talked about this. We talked about growing bulbs, and a lot of our hardy bulbs need to be exposed to cool temperatures between that 35 and around 50-degree mark, just to prepare them to leaf and certainly for flower growth. For a lot of bulbs, that optimum cooling period is going to be from 12 to about 16 weeks. Again, that's really going to vary based on the bulb you have. And how much you cool the plant can actually influence its growth. So if you don't cool the plant, a late flowering variety long enough, it was expecting more cold you're going to wind up with short stems. And if you have an early flowering variety and you cool it too long, it kind of starts out too early and you winds up with a really long stem. So it's important not only to have that cooling period, but to have it for the appropriate duration in order to get the right response from the plant we're growing. Getting a little bit into the mechanism of what's going on, kind of how we have the idea of that substance being produced, floralin being moving from the leaf up to the flower bud. What's been proposed is there's another substance, or possibly the same substance, called vernalin, and that is produced by those growing cells in the plant at the tip of the stem or in leaves, and that will then move to the flower bud in order to allow for the development of those flowers. And they've actually demonstrated that this substance is being produced because if you graft a cold treated plant onto a non-cold treated plant, non-vernalized plant, you actually get the production of flowers. So that plant that receives the graft from the cold treated plant will transmit that substance to the plant you grafted onto and provide that flowering response. Another way that we think about this is for chill hours, kind of the same idea. A lot of our fruit and nut trees, they're going to go dormant in the fall, and if we want them to flower and fruit in the next year, they have to receive the amount of chill hours, that cold treatment that they need in order to produce flowers. And different types of fruit trees, even different varieties of fruit trees, have different requirements for how much time they need to be between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 45 degrees Fahrenheit in order to actually flower. And we base that chilling requirement on the amount of cold we need to get about 50% of the buds to break and flower in the spring. There is a really useful application that MSU offers that really can track the amount of chill hours you get in your area, records the amount of chill hours that you've gotten so far in this area. It can be very specific on your location and is a really interesting thing. You can get it on your phone or look it up online. So just to kind of add another element to this, you do have situations where you have an interaction between light and temperature. So some plants that require that cold treatment then also need a critical day length or a long day in order to get that flowering to begin. Though there are some cases where in some other plants that low temperatures and cold treatment can actually reduce or completely eliminate the requirement for that photoperiod in plants. Again, really different based on what species that we're talking about. Just some kind of examples of that: biennial plants tend to be looking for cold temperatures, followed by those long days, but a lot of our perennial grasses are actually looking for cold, and then followed by short days. And if we think about when those plants are going to be flowering, that's a really good kind of way to think about it. So I just wanted to kind of get just a little addition to this. There are some ways that we treat plants that can absolutely influence how they flower, and I'll consider that part of the environment as well. And one thing that is important is how we fertilize. So fertilizing, certainly under fertilizing and not providing all of the plant the nutrients that it requires can reduce its ability to flower. And if the plant doesn't have all of the nutrient resources that it needs, it just may not flower at all. But additionally, sometimes over fertilizing can also lead to either poor flowering or no flowering at all. And that's particularly a response to nitrogen. And if you over fertilize with nitrogen, the plant really dedicates that energy to vegetative growth. Nitrogen is tends to be a limited resource in soils. and so there's a lot of competition for it amongst plants. And so, they really want to take that nitrogen in when it's there. And so once they have it in there, they've got to metabolize it, they've got to use it. And that leads to a lot of vegetative growth that can really take away from the energy that the plant needs in order to flower. Another thing that can influence flowering in plants is stress. It's not true of all plants, but it's something that I run into with vegetable transplants a lot. That if you go to a store and you look for the transplants that are being sold, sometimes they haven't been as well taken care of as we would like. And so you see some of the really very small transplants with flowers on them. And rather than that being a good sign, the plant's already flowering, it's going to reproduce really quickly or produce fruit really quickly. That tends to be a sign that the plant is actually responding to stress, and that can be drought stress. So the plant wasn't watered enough, and so it's trying to really get through its life cycle while it still can. So it's producing those flowers. Light stress or being in a shaded area where it's not getting as much light as it needs is another way that you might see that stress affect plants. And I didn't have a slide for it, but I did want to mention one other thing because it's a question that comes up a lot, and that's biennial bearing in fruit trees and how that comes about. So oftentimes you see a situation where a fruit tree will produce a large amount of fruit in a particular year, and then the next year it just doesn't produce fruit at all. And you get into this cycle where it produces every other year. And really kind of what's going on is the plant has put all of that energy into producing fruit. And then the next year, it just doesn't have the energy that it needs in order to produce those buds, or it may have gotten stressed in one year. And then the next year, it wanted to put on as many buds as it possibly could. And it just kind of overwhelms the tree. So the thing to do in response to this is to actually eliminate a lot of those buds. You can do that either by selecting every other bud on a particular branch and removing them, or removing all of the buds off of a particular branch. And what that does is just thin down the number of buds, and you can kind of train that plant back into the process of bearing every year. So I know that was a very quick run through the topic of how the environment and different things in the environment affect flowering. I will